Before we really get into this video, I want to take a quick moment and thank the wonderful website and YouTube channel World of Long Plays and this particular user, Ricky C. I did not want to have to record my entire Final Fantasy X gameplay experience just so I had stock footage, so I instead blatantly stole some footage from them. But they are a wonderful website, a wonderful channel, and I highly encourage you check them out if you like long plays, and maybe even consider donating to them on their website, longplays.org. In the early 2000s, I was living on the floor of my younger brother's bedroom. This was due to an odd situation involving both of my older brothers moving back home after being away. My oldest brother had finished college and was transitioning into the workforce and preparing for marriage. My other older brother had decided that he would finish his time at college by being a commuter student and not living on campus. I, meanwhile, had finally, for the first time in my sad and pathetic life, gotten a room all to myself, out of the room that I had always shared with my younger brother. Alas, due to my older brother's returning, I was booted back and slept on a mattress on the floor that I would push under my younger brother's bed every morning. Like I said, it was an odd time in life, and it tells you a bit about the family dynamics that I had to deal with. Still have to deal with, I guess. I distinctly remember one morning where I was woken up by a tickling sensation on my left forearm. I was asleep on my back with my left hand under my head and my forearm exposed to the world. This tickling sensation that woke me up turned out to be a cockroach that was making its way up my forearm and toward my face. Cockroaches were one of my biggest fears in the world back then, due largely to a very strange trend that tended to happen with the monstrous variety that lived in the southern US. Most people don't realize that southern cockroaches fly, and the ones that were around our house growing up loved to fly directly at my face whenever they saw me in a room. On this particular morning, when I saw this creature on my forearm being just brought out of sleeping status, I panicked, and my gut reaction was to swing my arm as hard as possible toward the wall, hurling this cockroach across the room to a fate that, well, I never found out because I instantly jumped off the mattress, sprinted out of the room, and never looked back. Now, I bring all this up because I can remember that moment with an odd level of clarity. It was almost 2 decades ago, yet I remember it in detail. The exact layout of the room, the angle from the floor as I hurled this disgusting germ-ridden creature toward the closet in the corner of the room. These are details. They've stuck with me for nearly 2 decades. And on the other side of things, I barely remember playing Final Fantasy X, which released in 2001. I know that I played it because I have these vague memories of having played it. Stuff like how interesting Blitzball seemed at the time, how creepy and unintimidating Seymour was as a villain, and that Auron was awesome. But that's really all. There's no plot detail, there's nothing from the story that really stands out when I think back to my first experience with the game when it released. I remember a throwaway moment in my early high school years where I was woken up by a cockroach. Yet Final Fantasy X, a much hyped PlayStation 2 release, is a game that I played to some extent and remember almost nothing about, of any importance at least. Besides the fact that Auron is awesome. I distinctly remember that. So with that strange curiosity as a driving force, I needed to revisit Final Fantasy X as a 32-year-old and try to figure out why such a game that, from what I could gather, had a pretty devoted fan base and was pretty well regarded as a game, left almost no impression on me. Released just a few years after the groundbreaking Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X was the third installment in Square's project towards guiding the Final Fantasy series into brand new, uncharted, and forward-thinking territory. Following the massive commercial success of FF7, they tried to push in several different directions, seeing what would help them move the series along and not stagnate in one particular RPG format. 7 broke away from so many classic elements that were common to the series. There were no real high fantasy influences, there was this brand new materia system, and a bunch of stuff that countless other videos have discussed in better detail, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. But 7 proved that as a company, they could be much bolder as they moved forward, and that they had built enough trust with their fan base that the fans will let them at least try it. For a period of time, they had that mentality, of course. That would never really, as a business practice, work and survive in the social media age. After that, Final Fantasy VIII took that general direction of 7 and tried to run in a much larger scope. Hey, let's make it 4 discs. Let's make it so the character models are all fully rendered out in all scenes and not these little chibi-style miniature versions of themselves. 9 was designed to be a bit of a nod to the older games in the series and their influences. Hey, look, the characters look much like, the traditional job classes that you might have known from the older games, and it's in a more high fantasy or medieval setting. And then 11 was going to be their entrance into the emerging MMORPG world, and that was, at this time, really coming into its own. Tucked in between, however, was Final Fantasy X. The first on the groundbreaking PlayStation 2, the first to have fully 3D environments, the first to have voice acting, although, man, that voice acting really leaves a lot to be desired. Except for you, Bender, you are always amazing. In fact, looking back, the PlayStation 2 might have arguably pushed the capabilities of consoles further than any other console in history. It was the console that proved that you really could make consoles that competed with a computer in terms of processing power. It was, at that time, a perfect canvas to paint the future of Final Fantasy X. 8 might have been the bigger game, 9 was the throwback game, but Final Fantasy X was the Final Fantasy of the future. At that point in time, in 2002, I hadn't played a traditional Final Fantasy game since I played 7 on the computer a few years earlier. I didn't try 8 or 9 because I didn't actually own a PlayStation. I always wanted a PlayStation for one particular game, and then as soon as my family got a PlayStation 2 when it released in 2001, I sprinted, or I guess, my mom drove me, to the Toys R Us that doesn't exist anymore, so that I could get the game that I had always wanted, a PlayStation 4. And I snagged a PlayStation Greatest Hits copy of Final Fantasy Tactics. The year after the PS2 came out, Final Fantasy X was finally unveiled, and it was also the first Final Fantasy game that I was actually ready and able to play since 7 years earlier. I believe, if I remember correctly, 2002, I rented this game from Blockbuster, because I don't recall ever actually owning it, but then again, this is kind of a weird, fuzzy time of my life. This is, middle school, about to start high school, and living on the floor of my younger brother's bedroom time of life. So, you can kind of infer how I feel about that era. As far as the story of Final Fantasy X goes, it involves you playing as somebody who's apparently named Tidus and not Titus, like I've blindly assumed for the past 20 years. Which, if you ask me, isn't really the greatest name I've ever heard, but this is Final Fantasy. It's not a franchise that's really known for the chief protagonist having a great name. Tidus is thrown 1,000 years into the future, into a technologically void world known as Spira. This world has long been ravaged by a monster named Sin, who I think might be the Dreamfish from Link's Awakening. The rest of the game involves you navigating a sea of butts and booty shorts to try and defeat the Dreamfish. And that's essentially the entire plot. Like, I could put a spoiler warning up here, but you kind of already know what the goal of the game is, and from here on out, it doesn't really introduce anything like super different. There are minor plot twists, but none that truly rock your world. Your primary traveling companion is a summoner who you are helping on her pilgrimage, and her biggest obstacle is the fact that she's the daughter of a famous summoner, and that's a really heavy burden for her to live up to. That's largely it. That's kind of where the conflicts arise in this story. In this case, the lack of a stunning surprise, one that really rocks your world, it works. It isn't a bad one. You see, Final Fantasy X plays best linearly. While 7 offered solid side quests as you progressed, 10 doesn't really give you much of any side stuff until the very end, when it kind of throws all of it at you at once. But again, this works, because the stuff they're trying to introduce with this game is big enough and bold enough that it helps pave the way moving forward and you don't miss some of those more open world elements. Then there's the leveling system, the sphere grid. It's this cool mechanic where you have this map of intersecting pathways, and as you progress through the game and your characters level up, they can go down all of these different pathways and learn unique skills. Or they can intersect with other teammates and double up on the skills that those other party members share. Even though the sphere grid offers some level of customization on how you develop your skills, you realize pretty quickly that, it's kind of best to keep the characters moving down their natural passageways as much as possible. Again, it works best in a more linear format. Moving around the large map of this beautiful new world, based more off of like Southeast Asia than maybe some of the other games have been, it all feels beautiful and it feels open, even though it's pretty much one large snaking highway toward a final goal. It's not a world to run around in, but each section of the map is a straightforward, fairly linear pathway, leading to another world and then another after that. The structure of Final Fantasy X has more in common with the level flow of Super Mario Bros. Than it does Final Fantasy VII. But once again, this design works well for this story, which is unfortunate that the optional quests really pile up right at the end, which takes away a bit from the gravity of the story if you don't play it all the way through in a linear format. But again, this works because the story is pretty straightforward. You arrive, you have to defeat Sin, you find out some secrets along the way, sure, but ultimately it's still Sin that you have to defeat. You don't ever have to go back to any older area that you visited, ever. The optional side stuff in Final Fantasy VII makes you feel more prepared to face the next story area that you go to face, or to survive the difficult northern crater. In Final Fantasy X, the optional side stuff feels a little bit more like stuff to come back to after you finish the story and you want to face a new challenge. As a game, Final Fantasy X was incredibly well received, and it still has for the most part a very high reputation amongst fans. All of this adds to my personal confusion as to why I just don't recall much about playing it back then, as having played it now in my adulthood and under the lens of trying to evaluate and dissect it 2 decades later, I really enjoyed it. And at this point in the video, I do want to make it very clear that I enjoyed this game. I don't want to leave any confusion here, because one of my other video essays that I did that I thought, really conveyed quite well how Horizon Zero Dawn as a game made me reevaluate my life was actually kind of greeted with some people going, "Oh man, I liked that game. Sorry to hear you didn't like it." And I'm like, well, that wasn't what I was saying, and so I want to be clear. Final Fantasy X was quite honestly a few steps away from being a genuine, timeless masterpiece. Instead of what it really is, of a phenomenal PlayStation 2 game that doesn't necessarily hold up quite as well as game technology has advanced. Like, let's just say that they make Blitzball a bit more fun, or maybe even halfway interesting at all, and suddenly the ability to completely break away from the story and recruit players, compete in a league, that sort of thing, that's an amazing change in a game that, without a really viable side quest, is extremely linear. Something like Blitzball could provide that bit of variation, of change, that is sort of lacking in the game. Or one of the things in Final Fantasy VII that some people love, some people hate, is chocobo racing and breeding and all of that. Then you have Final Fantasy X, where you really only ride a chocobo in kind of one area, and the controls are so terrible. I mean, just make them halfway usable, seriously. Or maybe the programmers should have, assumed that maybe nobody enjoys the challenge of dodging lightning for the rest of their lives. Now, I realize now that I'm mostly talking about how much the side quests or minigames sucked, but that's a major part of it, because it is ultimately, the main thing that this game is missing. The core of it is quite good, but there's really no reason to ever depart from the main story. There are a few core areas that could have made improvement. Obviously make the voice acting or the writing a bit better.
Smile, let me see. Sad.
maybe making the end game enemies more of like a challenge and less filled with a bunch of really cheesy insta-kill sort of abilities that kind of just take away from your enjoyment of the competitive end game content. Maybe you take away weird elements like needing to randomly and unexplainably grab glowing items in order to trigger the final boss. There's really no context as to why that's happening. The music itself is pretty good, fairly memorable, except for the one final boss song, which I really, really wish that I could forget. Oh, and on that note, maybe make a final boss who doesn't go grah every time you hit him. Again, maybe I'm nitpicking. Because if I'm trying to critique the core of the game, I do have to do a little bit of nitpicking. Most of this stuff doesn't actually matter, and it doesn't take away from the enjoyment. But there are a few major flaws that do get in the way. Primarily, make the characters into people that I actually care a little bit more about. I honestly feel nothing when Waka talks about his dead brother. I never once care who Lord Braska is or why his legacy impacts Yuna. The biggest emotional response that I had during the entire game was when Seymour says he committed genocide against the Ronso. And really that's just because it kind of comes out of nowhere and it shocks you. It catches you off guard with how messed up it is. But then you don't see any of the effects of his claim of genocide anywhere. I mean, you barely saw the Ronso before this moment in the game. How can you even tell if they're gone? Nobody really mentions any genocide if you walk backwards to where they're supposed to be, and your own party member who's a Ronso is unfazed, and then the whole situation is never addressed again. It seems like in an attempt to make great, fully 3D at all times characters with complete voice acting and all of that, that they couldn't really make them lifelike or memorable. They made robots, and believe me, it's noticeable. And it's maybe more noticeable knowing now what technology can do, but look at Final Fantasy XII that came out on the same system just a couple years later, and you can kind of see how maybe with a little bit more artistic creativity or a particular artistic style to aim for, you can make characters that look a little bit better than the ones that are in Final Fantasy X. Or at the very least that, you know, don't creep you out every so often like a weird Chuck E. Cheese animatronic. At times, because of these particular shortcomings of, you know, any real attachment to the characters in a particular way, the game can feel just a little devoid of life. Now that said, if you're just a few steps away from making a masterpiece, then you've still ended up making a pretty freaking good game. It's one that I really enjoyed finally getting back to after having only the vaguest of memories from back then in my early high school, end of middle school days. I think, much like my living situation, which was, again, a mattress on the floor of a bedroom that was not my own, that this game and that living situation was all part of a weird time of life for me. And because of all of that and everything going on, I probably just couldn't appreciate this game for what it was. I recently made a decision during these terrible COVID times that we live in that I really needed to stop focusing on stuff that would pretty much just be an attempt to improve my standing with people. You know, to focus on stuff that I really wanted to focus on for my own benefit, like long-winded and totally pointless video essays about games I'm playing. Essentially, I've started to realize, or at least started to actually think and believe, that I'm in a stage of life where I don't have to pay my dues anymore. I should be able to reap some benefit to all the work that I have done so far in my adulthood. And with that, there's an aspect of Final Fantasy X that feels a bit like paying your dues. But I do mean that in a good way. It doesn't really benefit you to do much grinding in this game, something that I actually kind of enjoy in an RPG these days. The difficulty of the game is well scaled throughout, so that it's not much fun to try to get OP that badly because you never really reach a point through grinding where it seems like you're going to, I don't know, just be able to cast Knights of the Round and destroy any opponent you find. Every single battle, even against random mobs, requires a decent amount of thought, of strategy. It's why it's really cool and important that they give you the option to rotate party members freely in battle. The fun here is in the free flow of warfare. It's a bit different than what they've done in the past, but it's changing, it's growing, it's leaving middle school and starting high school. Final Fantasy as a series was changing at this time. 11 was an MMO. 12 coming out later on was an open world game with no random encounters. And 13 was divisive because it was super linear and maybe too linear for some to love. And at that time I was changing too. I mean, not just because of the age I was in the early 2000s, but because I was about to enter high school and then just a few years later be going off to college. I would soon start working those classic high school after-school jobs just a few years after this game would release and I would rent it from Blockbuster. Final Fantasy and I were both trying to grow up back then. And if I really think back to those days, do I actually remember much of anything? I mean, the cockroach story, sure. Some occasional times hanging out with friends. A whole lot of awkwardness, of course. Brief moments, though. How much of the pre-high school years actually stand out to me? It makes me wonder if maybe, now that I'm in my 30s, I should look back a little bit more fondly on those years. Or at least look back with a little bit less bias of, they were too awkward and I don't really want to think about middle school or early high school all that much. Maybe I should revisit those years a little bit more honestly. Much like this game, and so many Final Fantasy games, because reality being questionable and subjective is a common theme in the entire series. It does make me wonder what my reality is. Did I really even throw that cockroach? I mean, I never saw its corpse. Did I really even play Final Fantasy X back then? I vaguely remembered more and more storylines and moments as I played it right now, but I don't really know how far I got, or if I ever beat it, or anything. And with that, the question becomes, what did Final Fantasy X accomplish? It's very, very pretty, especially after the much-deserved HD remaster that came out a few years later. But does it really do anything better than any other Final Fantasy game? It's not open world, and I mean, it pushed the boundaries of graphics, but did it push the boundaries of graphics as much as, say, 15, the major open world entry in the series did? The action isn't high-paced like Final Fantasy 13, which of course was super linear, so the pace worked. The visuals are great, but you couldn't argue that it did anything better than 12 was going to do on the same system pretty soon. It doesn't do the weird religious symbolism and secret evil church concept as well as my beloved Final Fantasy Tactics, which is the most criminally underrated storyline of any of the Final Fantasy games. I stand by that. But I don't know, maybe that's it. Maybe, just like my time spent sleeping on the floor of my brother's room, Final Fantasy X was primarily a chance to move through one period of life and into the next. To officially say, okay, cool, we made a lot of true turn-based RPGs in the 90s. We jump-started the JRPG genre as the world knows it now. As pioneers, it's time for us to go in new directions. So, Final Fantasy X is a transitional game in that regard, like those middle school years are for so many of us, and much like those years of life, which we are quick to brush off, to ignore as being too awkward and not really worth revisiting. Final Fantasy X is a game that deserves another look, a better appreciation maybe than perhaps it was given at first.